I came to the Demon's Souls remake via two unrelated games. Spelunky, a roguelike platformer widely considered a near-perfect expression of the form. I did not enjoy it. What struck me was the repetition and frustration. Then there's Sucker Punch's Ghost of Tsushima. There's plenty I didn't like about it, but the combat was a revelation. It is derivative, including of From Software's games, but I hadn't played any of those. I'd seen footage of Dark Souls and I knew the pedigree. I was also familiar with Bluepoint, having watched Digital Foundry tech-focused videos, linked in the show notes, on both this game and 2018's PS4 exclusive Shadow of the Colossus. But Demon's Souls is one of those games where just watching it fails to convey the experience. So much of it plays out in your head. I was also aware, or so I thought, of the hallmarks of From Software's games. Brutal, unforgiving combat and repeated dying. It sounded like pure frustration, but ultimately the impeccable presentation of this 2020 remake drew me in. I wanted to experience it, even if I bounced off it. I decided it would be my Christmas game. Over the next 5 weeks, I'd go on to put 120 hours into Demon's Souls, playing it through twice, slowly. This is the moment that hooked me. Squatting in the bowels of the prison of hope, a writhing mass of bodies contorted into the shape of something menacing, single-minded, a nightmare-fueled Katamari Damacy. I had no idea what this thing was or what it could do to me. I was thinking about how little I knew, what I'd gained, and what I stood to lose. I submit to you my review of Demon's Souls. Let's back up a bit. The original Demon's Souls was a PlayStation 3 exclusive developed by From Software, a Tokyo-based studio at the time perhaps better known among gamers of a certain age for their Armored Core series, bits of which ended up in the Demon's Souls engine. The title released in Japan in February 2009, followed by North America in October of that same year, and June 2010 in most other territories. For context, the big releases that year were Rocksteady's Arkham Asylum, Valve's Left 4 Dead 2, Sony's PS3 Slim, and the last good Assassin's Creed game. Initial reception in Japan was lukewarm, but word of mouth created a sizable grey import market in North America and Europe. The game went on to become a critical and, to FromSoft's surprise, commercial success. It also comprehensively reshaped FromSoft. Everything they've released since has been influenced by it, or rather by its success. Franchise creative director Hidetaka Miyazaki was catapulted to the head of the studio and has become something of a rock star. Then, in 2020, Bluepoint, with input from Japan's studio, which was involved in the original, released this remake as a PlayStation 5 exclusive. It leaves the original gameplay largely untouched. Bluepoint's approach to remaking classic PlayStation games is fascinating. If you're interested in the technical details, I recommend you check out the Digital Foundry interview with Bluepoint on 2018's Shadow of the Colossus. They take the original game engine, get it working on the target hardware, then strip away the rendering and audio pipelines, along with certain other low-level system calls, and hand them over to Bluepoint's own game engine, which runs alongside the original. The results speak for themselves, I think. They've developed a reputation for being amongst the best in the business for remakes, and were acquired by Sony in 2021. Although sales figures are comparable to other PS5 exclusives adjusted for launch date, around 1.4 million copies globally through October 2021, outside of the Souls community, the Demon's Souls remake has flown under the radar. For comparison, Ghost of Tsushima, a cross-gen PS4-PS5 product, released just 4 months before Demon's Souls and has sold 8 million copies. I sort of wonder how many people are actually playing Demon's Souls though. Apparently some 420,000 players haven't beat the first boss. No PC port has yet been announced, but I'd bet it's coming. Sony also acquired well-regarded porting house Nixes last year as part of their recent push to the PC platform. They'd be crazy not to do it. Dark Souls is huge on PC, despite having poor quality ports. There's some indication that Sony intends to preserve a 2-year exclusivity period on PlayStation hardware, so if this is indeed coming, we might expect to hear about it this year. So what kind of game is it? While I'm reviewing the 2020 remake, my comments on gameplay apply equally to the 2009 original. The game remains Miyazaki's brood, even if Bluepoint's the stepfather. The original Demon's Souls and subsequent games in the From Software stable, known collectively as the Soulsborne games, spawned an entire genre, the Souls-like. At release in 2009, however, the game stood apart as a piece of game design. The most compelling evidence for this is that it wasn't well understood. 2 anecdotes stand out. Sony's then president, Shuhei Yoshida, famously called it an unbelievably bad game after a 2-hour playtest. And the game's producer, Takeshi Kaji, also from Sony, recalls that people trying the game out at 2008's Tokyo Game Show were walking away just a few minutes in. In a nice bit of symmetry, Shuhei Yoshida was the one to announce the remake in Sony's June 2020 State of Play event, calling it something very near and dear to me. And indeed, it can be hard to get your bearings if you're coming to the Soulsborns for the first time. The character creation process greets you with an array of recognizable fantasy archetypes, but these are more nominal than they look. Your character ends up being defined more by the distinct disciplines they pursue than whatever their starting point is. My magic user ended up being pretty handy with her weapon of choice, the winged spear, and my temple knight ended up dabbling in magic. In both cases, I made extensive use of a bow. There are some good reasons to specialise, but experimentation is part of the fun, especially on your first playthrough. I don't know that Demon's Souls cares too much about ensuring that difficulty is carefully balanced across classes either. Magic ability seems to be a substantial edge. After a short tutorial, you're dropped into a central hub known as the Nexus. The Nexus is connected to 5 unique story worlds through a network of fast travel portals. In the beginning, only the portal to the first world, the Kingdom of Boletaria, is open to you. Each world is subdivided into discrete areas. As you fight your way through, you receive souls from defeated foes, which serve as both experience points and currency. Opening the portal to the next area requires besting an area boss, each a demon with a unique appearance, moveset, and challenge. Player skill and knowledge are at the heart of Demon's Souls combat in a way that was unique at the time and remains rare today. Structurally, your experience is separated into runs, bookended by death. If you die carrying souls, they drop where you fall. If you're unable to reach and reclaim them on your next run, they're lost. Any weapons and items you collect persist across runs. You can return to the Nexus from any portal to heal and to spend your souls on new consumables and equipment, or on leveling up, which nets you stat increases. The main cost of death to you as a player is initially embodied in those lost souls, foregone opportunities to level up your character or purchase or upgrade equipment, although these dynamics change as you approach the mid-game. Each time you die or go through a portal, all of the non-boss and non-story related enemies are reset. But there's a further consequence of dying. You lose your human form and take instead what's called soul form. The giveaway is the ethereal glow. In this form, your health is halved. While it can be partially reclaimed with an equipable magic ring found early on, you have to give up one of only 2 precious ring slots. The main consequence of the soul form mechanic has to do with difficulty balancing, but we'll get to that later. There's definitely a Metroidvania influence. Success at boss fights opens additional portals, allowing you to push deeper into the world. You also unlock environmental shortcuts that let you avoid certain level sections entirely and the fights they normally entail. These unlocks persist across runs. Your steadily increasing knowledge of each level's layout and the additional portals and shortcuts you open gives you the freedom to play the game on your own terms. Player control over pacing turns out to be critical to moderating the mid-game difficulty spike. Most of this is evident within the first few hours of play. The genius that takes a little longer to reveal itself, though, is that the game is just as much about player disposition. But first, I want to talk about how good this game looks. A substantial part of the environment, creature and sound design credit has to go to the original From Software team. Bluepoint's work is intended to be faithful to those original designs while building on them to take advantage of new tech, including a 60 FPS performance mode, transformative against the original 30. But it's also their own stylistic take on the Demon's Souls aesthetic. While I think there are interesting questions around Bluepoint's artistic changes versus the original, I want to focus on the end product. If you're interested in digging into the differences, check out the excellent no-clip documentary linked in the show notes. The game's opening tunnel sequence is immediately impactful as a statement of artistic intent. Unusually amongst his Japanese contemporaries, game director Hidetaka Miyazaki drew on European folklore and mythology. He specifically cites the influence of Arthurian and Germanic folklore, the movies Conan the Barbarian and Excalibur, and the artwork of Frank Frazetta. Choose-your-own-adventure style gamebooks were also cited. The game's first world, the Kingdom of Boletaria, best embodies this traditional dark fantasy aesthetic, replete with crumbling castles, soaring spires, portcullis, knights, and dragons. No matter where you are, there's a pervasive sense of being either hemmed in or teetering on the edge of a precipice. Corridors are tight, dim, and claustrophobic. The camera tucks in close, frequently occluded. Verticality is everywhere. The architecture somehow, impossibly, always seems to be falling away from you on all sides. Precarious staircases, crumbling bridges, rudimentary elevator cages disappearing into inky blackness. The lighting, including weather and environmental effects, is foreboding and atmospheric. The cloying, dense greys of the sky over Boletaria, intermittently cracked by the roar of dragonfire. Ragged lightning illuminating the eldritch horrors of the Prison of Hope. The sun-bleached palette of Stonefang. The unbroken drizzle of the Shrine of Storms. Enemies in the early stages of Boletaria are recognisably traditional dark fantasy. Soldiers, knights, dragons. But even these are suffused with dread. The desperate, flailing way that dredgelings throw themselves at you. The relentless mechanical advance of the Blue-Eye Knights, their raspy mouth-breathing evoking demonic possession. the shriek of a dragon giving you a few precious seconds notice of the coming firestorm. And yet these more conventional archetypes quickly give way to creature design that leans into the grotesque, the disgusting, the disturbing. I think the superficial familiarity of the dark fantasy setting, especially in the early game, is intended to draw you into complacency, into assumptions about the experience ahead of you, which the game then subverts in ways that get progressively weirder and more disturbing. I think this feeds into a broader point about keeping you in a state of constant disorientation and wonder. The game wants to show, not tell, and it wants you to ask yourself, how could this place, this piece of architecture, this creature exist? Perhaps it's also pushing back on how conservative our fantasy tropes have become in gaming. In addition to the influences explicitly mentioned by Miyazaki, there are on full display Lovecraftian terrors, John Carpenter-style body horror, and hints of special effects master Phil Tippett's weirder work. I've already mentioned the ball of bodies, but there are plenty of other standouts even in the early game. The Mind Flayers in the Prison of Hope evoke both Cthulhu and Charles Dickens. The man centipede looks straight out of The Thing. Hoplites have the distinct appearance of fecal matter, by which I mean they look like shit. These are the products of a disturbed psyche, and it's fantastic. When I hear Lovecraftian, I think of tentacles. And yeah, Demon's Souls has got them. But it's more than just an aesthetic. It's how the unknowability, the ungraspability of a thing feeds into its horror that are the core themes of Lovecraft's writing. Demon's Souls is ultimately still bound by convention, and for good reason. There's a video game here that needs playing. But there's no question that FromSoft, or more likely Miyazaki himself as the original auteur, embraced these themes as part of the Demon's Souls experience. For me, Bluepoint's aesthetic reimagining is entirely successful at carrying these themes onto modern hardware. It's not just environment and creature design though. It's also apparent in the game's lore and narrative design. Understanding this helps to contextualize From Software's original ambition for the title. Producer Takeshi Kaji. Our approach was really to try to sidestep preset narrative. There's no real story unfolding in front of you. Rather, the experience is all about you and the choices you're making step by step. In a sense, I feel like the game returns to the approach of early video games, where you're anxious at every step. You feel as if death and failure are watching over your shoulder all the time, but that is tempered by the sense of intense joy when you surpass a challenge. Those very human feelings are what we wanted to explore in Demon's Souls, and that's where the fun lies. By design, the explicit narrative setup gives you just enough to place yourself in the world. Good versus evil, with you as the central protagonist, known simply as the Slayer of Demons. Interactions with NPCs, which occur in real time and in-engine, are well produced with mostly convincing facial animation tech. They're substantially elevated by the uniformly superb voice acting, which is among the best I've seen in a game. While narrative is sparing, the lore of the world of Demon's Souls is deep, and environmental storytelling and creature design do the heavy lifting here. There's a limit to how much of it you can piece together by yourself though, in-game on a single playthrough. I recommend the excellent lore deep dives of the VatiVidya YouTube channel if you need a guide. Final word on haptics. According to creative director Gavin Moore, the Bluepoint audio team were responsible for creating the waveforms that control the haptic vibrations in the DualSense controller. Full-featured haptics integration is still rare on the platform, but the result is distinctive and very effective. Approaching this thing in the Tower of Latria, I was surprised to note that you can feel the force of its pulsing transmitted through the architecture, intensifying as you approach. Magic status effects on your character and weapons also create a subtle pulsing effect, complementing visual cues. I'm generally skeptical of the value of haptics in gaming, but these strike an excellent balance between providing useful information, but doing it discreetly. Developer ambition is valuable context when looking at the design of a game. In this spirit, I want to kick off with a couple of quotes from creative director Hidetaka Miyazaki, which together serve to dispel one popular misconception in particular. People need to make comparisons, and our game has been likened to Diablo, Wizardry, Monster Hunter, and even Bushido Blade, but none quite fit. I think this is because our orientation for the game was so different. We weren't built around cutscenes or scenario, as in so many action RPGs. Rather, our aim was to have the player feel rewarded simply by playing the game, not for completing a quest or finding a prize or winning loot, but simply by playing and experiencing the game. Since its launch in 2009, Demon's Souls has acquired a reputation as egregiously frustrating, something that put me off playing Soulsborns for years. I feel it's a mischaracterization, or at least overly reductive. Miyazaki again. Having the game be difficult was never the goal. What we set out to do was strictly to provide a sense of accomplishment. We understood that difficulty is just one way to offer an intense sense of accomplishment through forming strategies, overcoming obstacles, and discovering new things. There's plenty of evidence in the design of the game itself that FromSoft wanted to mitigate player frustration while preserving the core element of challenge, and I think this becomes clear from looking at Demon's Souls' core gameplay loops in detail. Decomposing those loops will show, I think, how the game transcends its inauspicious development origins to claim its place as an enduring masterpiece. When we talk about challenging gameplay, we're talking not only about the physical act of button mashing, but also about putting the player in a state where they're being asked to make a sustained series of decisions that have impactful trade-offs. Demon's Souls excels at this, both in the moment-to-moment gameplay and in the meta progression. While combat might be the first thing we think about when we think about Soulsborns, the context around each combat encounter, such as environment design and AI, is just as interesting. We can think of all of this together as encounter design. Environments are all handcrafted, and they feed strongly into encounter design. Enemy placement is mostly static. With few exceptions, enemies don't patrol. They wait on the spot for you to appear. This can initially be jarring, but what it uniquely enables is clever combinations of environment design and enemy placement. High ground, low ground, precipitous staircases, claustrophobic corridors, safe spots to recover your stamina between blows. Every encounter is given a distinctiveness owing to the way it sits uniquely in its environment. Environments also shape your weapon choices. Each weapon traces its own unique arc through the environment that depends on whether it's a slashing, piercing or crushing weapon, its size and shape, and whether you're using a light attack or heavy. Colliding with the scenery at any point along this arc either robs your strike of much of its force or causes it to fail outright. In the worst case, the wrong weapon leaves you completely incapable of striking your target. A memorable diversion into piercing weapons early on in one of my playthroughs happened simply because I was trying to fight fleshy targets in the tight corridors of the Prison of Hope, where wide sword swings frequently glance off the architecture. This then led me to appreciate the additional range conferred by spears and polearms, pushing me to develop an entirely new playstyle. Unfortunately, enemy attacks sometimes appear to clip through scenery. When they do, you notice it, because it contrasts with how fair the combat usually feels. More egregious is the camera. It's pulled in close, and it doesn't pass transparently through scenery. In fact, the 2020 remake does pull the camera back slightly from the 2009 original, a welcome change, but it's frequently occluded in a game that emphasises close-quarter engagements in tight spaces. In addition, locking onto your enemies, key combat functionality, wrests control of the camera away from you, causing it to swing in behind you to laser focus on your enemy. I don't mind this aspect so much, but it's locked there. You should be able to manually rotate the camera off axis to get a better sense of your surroundings. But perhaps it was felt that changing this would be too serious a departure from the 2009 original. The original design seems to have been constrained by the camera conventions of the time. Enemy AI in Demon's Souls mainly manifests itself in pathfinding and tactics. It sits at an interesting juncture of technical competence, encounter design, and player incentives. Out of context, it's serviceable. Each enemy has a distinct moveset, which gives it strengths and weaknesses. There's complexity in terms of the way actions are chained together, but also consistency. The movesets can be decomposed and learned, and in time countered. And indeed, Demon's Souls asks you to master that process as part of its core gameplay loop. But context turns out to be definitive. Demon's Souls doesn't depend on maintaining the illusion of sheer AI competency for its force as an immersive experience. The main tool, in fact, is carefully calibrated encounter design, a tool only available to designers with perfect advanced knowledge of enemy positioning in the environment. It serves to elevate the effectiveness of the AI as a gameplay component. At its very best, especially when confronting new and unfamiliar enemies, it can surprise you in ways that will have you muttering your admiration or contempt into the 3 a.m. blackness. Enemy placement shapes the environment just as the environment influences enemy placement. They're two sides of the same coin. While some placements are also realistic in a visual sense, soldiers guard bridges and man towers, for example, I think this is incidental. Most placements are explicitly gamey, designed to create maximum havoc and environmental risk for the player. Enemies placed immediately around a blind corner, at the top of a staircase, blocking a path forward, in areas that overlap with ranged attack cones of other enemies. This is where things get weird though. Careful encounter design and static enemy placement cuts both ways. The designers can set a challenging trap for me, but they only get to surprise me with it once. In a game that asks you to repeat encounters many times as a matter of course, you more often than not find that through trial and error, you're armed with extensive advanced knowledge of where enemies are and how they'll respond to different tactics. Aside from the early game, where souls have an outsized value to them, the in-game stakes of being killed are moderate. In this way, you're incentivized to experiment, and pretty soon you'll hit your first opportunity to cheese an encounter. Perhaps there's a part of the scenery your enemy can't reach. Perhaps a bit of self-defeating behavior that's constant and easily exploited. Enemy pathfinding bugs and steep environmental drops are a good example of this. This happens in both regular encounters and boss fights. It's hard for me to look at the way this game handles cheesing and not see intentional design, or at least sly winking awareness. Take this alcove in the Armor Spider Cavern. It's inconceivable that the designers weren't aware of this, yet it makes the encounter trivial. It feels like an intentional subversion of the way players relate to the game. Reading about Miyazaki's early life and career, he comes across as a bit of a maverick, one that's found success in a famously hierarchical and rules-bound culture. He's also said that his own life experiences influenced the design of Demon's Souls. So is all of this a bug or a feature? Is it a parable on complying with pointless rules? Hard to say, but the apparent contradictions are fascinating and the tension runs through the whole game. Here's a counterexample that I found particularly interesting. These guys are carefully arrayed around this small patch of ground. There's something of obvious interest there to the player, but this encounter was surprisingly resilient to cheesing. Unlike many other encounters, these guys won't be kited away with arrows or ranged magic attacks. In fact, you can see them here taking apparent steps to get out of their way, and if you manage to convince one to pursue you, he won't go too far before making a big show of letting you off the hook and returning to his station. This really stood out to me. It's in these details, and the way they contrast with other encounters where the same strategies might work, that Demon's Souls encounter design is at its most confounding and compelling. Preparation is essential to success in combat. There are strict limits on the weight of equipped weapons and armour. Exceeding them incurs a movement and stamina penalty, but your general carry capacity is much more generous and can be bolstered by an early game magic item. This allows you to carry in your notional backpack a variety of weapons and armour, which you can swap out on the fly to tailor your approach to each encounter. A quality of life change, unique to the remake, allows you to send any loot you find in-world directly to your stash. Combined, these reject the frustration of having to abandon loot or slog back to the Nexus to change loadouts, placing the emphasis instead on knowledge and skill in combat. There are comparatively few discrete combat controls. In terms of absolute number of button presses, Ghost of Tsushima's combat feels busier. That's mostly down to the large number of consumables on hand, the stance mechanic, and the way both of those things are mapped to the control pad. Demon's Souls combat is mechanically simple enough that new players can quickly grasp the essentials: light attack, block, dodge, roll. These simple building blocks are stitched together into the zen of combat. Your melee attacks have a narrow window of effectiveness, which depends on complex interactions of weapon and enemy type, environment, stamina, positioning, timing, and staggering. Either side of that window, effectiveness falls off precipitously, and overextending leaves you vulnerable to counterattack. Shield blocking is essential, as is managing your stamina bar, which underwrites your ability to strike, roll, and withstand your enemy's blows. For new players, most encounters are dangerous. Even lower level enemies will punish your mistakes. Poor timing, poor positioning, poor decision making. Enemies won't approach you until you're within their range of perception, which is considerably shorter than player visual range. An early game magical item further reduces this, which can be essential to crowd control. Engaging more than one powerful enemy at a time is often fatal. Kiting is frequently advantageous. Although difficult, combat is also legible. With experience, you'll notice that enemies telegraph almost everything: striking, casting spells, imbibing buffs. As a result, when you die, it feels fair. After the best deaths, you feel respect. Enemies sometimes give the impression of adjusting their tactics in interesting ways from one run to the next, although I doubt this is intentional. In the beginning, every encounter is a trial. You cling to the shield block button and flail wildly with light attack. But at some point, you start to grimly tolerate and then finally relish each fight. You relax, you start dropping your shield in between strikes, managing your stamina. You start circling around behind enemies as they swing at the empty air. You even start experimenting with parrying and two-handing your weapon. Then bam, you get set on fire and pinned to the ramparts with a spear. My one systematic criticism would be the unreasonable effectiveness of rolling behind an enemy and backstabbing, somewhat mitigated by the predilection for narrow corridors and falling hazards. It doesn't help everywhere, and it still relies on proper timing, but it's a little too reliable. Inevitably, you will meet enemies that feel impossibly difficult. It becomes more acute in the mid-game especially, but you'll experience it as a new player too. Doing the same fight over and over can be frustrating. It's not the death per se, but the repetition. But Demon's Souls doesn't insist that you keep dashing yourself against the rocks. Yes, you have to beat the bosses to advance the story and finish the game, but portals to each of the 5 worlds are all opened after besting the game's first demon. That tells you something about how FromSoft intends the game to be played. The option to walk away is always there, and it's key to moderating your frustration. Of course, whether you do is entirely up to you. Demon's Souls combat challenges you in a way that demands the application of skill, quickly putting you into a flow state. Through careful, escalating encounter design, and by allowing players to approach challenges in the order that makes sense to them, Demon's Souls tries to keep you consistently at the edge of your competence in that flow state. I want to turn to how Demon's Souls handles progression, and it's here that things get a bit messy. Aspects of key gameplay systems remained unclear to me even tens of hours in. On the face of it, this is pretty egregious. A generous interpretation might be that it's consistent with the game's show-don't-tell approach, best embodied in the predilection for lore over exposition, a misguided attempt to perpetuate mystery and wonder. But would those design goals really have been undermined by a few explanatory sentences in the pause menu? As it stands, players need to consult an outside source to make sense of and enjoy this game. It is important that there's space for games that don't show all their cards, and that make demands of you, sometimes unreasonable demands. Games that require careful dissection. But you'd expect that to be in service of player engagement, not in conflict with it. In that light, some of Demon's Souls' design decisions are baffling. I want to start with the good bits, and hopefully that helps to contextualize the bad bits. In terms of the way you progress through the physical world and towards the conclusion of your character's arc, in general the news is good. Confusion as to where to go and what to do is your main enemy in the early game, but it's tempered by the wondrous environment and creature design and by the uniqueness of the experience. Your journey starts out as a train of ceaseless, amorphous violence, staggering from one bloody encounter to the next, trying to get a handle on what's happening. But gradually the contours of a video game become distinct. Your runs start to have purpose, even if you don't yet fully understand it. You begin to think in terms of trying to achieve something, then, if that fails, trying something else. You might expect to be treading the same path time and time again owing to the world design, and in fact spaces are reused extensively. At first, as you try without success to survive through until the next portal, and then later with more specific purpose, farming healing grass or crafting materials, for example. In practice though, this doesn't really feel like a problem. Portals and shortcuts are mostly thoughtfully placed to minimise undue repetition. There are a couple of exceptions, but on the whole a reasonable balance is struck. The fact that souls, your experience points and currency, can be lost sets up an interesting economy of incentives on each run too. The further away you get from the safety of the last archstone portal, the more souls you accumulate. This sets up a tension. Press on for more souls and loot, or return to the Nexus to spend what you have, knowing that in doing so your enemies will be reset. I felt I had arrived at the mid-game when I had a fuller understanding of my priorities, but found myself confronted with 3 or 4 discrete challenges that I couldn't overcome. Each a distinct gauntlet of enemy and environmental hazards capped by an encounter with a boss, barring forward progress. Key to surmounting these challenges for me was to take my time, relish the experience of playing the game, and know when to put the controller down and walk away. In hindsight, the mid-game turned out to have the most frustrating difficulty spike. Failure is usually some combination of your own technical shortcomings in combat and missing a crucial piece of knowledge about enemy weaknesses or tactics, a weapon with a particular class of damage, or some protective item. Some of these things you can deduce for yourself. It should be no great surprise that a creature known as Flame Lurker requires a ring of fire resistance. Others are more obscure, but rarely are you being explicitly asked to go away and grind out stat increases in order to progress. Character leveling is generally well handled. Each level grants you 1 additional point, which you can apply to any of your 8 character stats. Stat increases do matter. This is a game of inches after all, and they buy you extra margin. But they also unlock additional discrete abilities, such as access to heavier or rarer weapon types, or an increase in the number of spells or miracles you can access at any given time. Even more compelling, your choices entail trade-offs. Leveling becomes progressively more expensive the further you get into the game, and is only partially offset by increased souls from more difficult enemies. It's impractical to max out all your stats in a single playthrough, so you have to pick and choose based on your chosen playstyle, which necessarily entails closing the door on others. Excluding world tendency, which I'll get to in a minute, there's no enemy scaling. As you level up and acquire better equipment, enemies become weaker relative to you. Sometimes the effect is subtle, as with a slowly advancing strength stat, for example. The Shrine of Storms is transformed by the acquisition of the Winged Spear, augmented with magic enchantment, for engagement at a distance, or a club, which crushing damage type is particularly effective against many of the enemies there. This is by design, but the balance can be tough to get right. Challenging combat is central to the Soulsborne experience. You want to avoid a situation where leveling renders encounters trivial, because it sets up weird incentives for the player. Most notably, it drives them to farm for souls rather than play for enjoyment. Demon's Souls partly addresses this by making each level more expensive in soul terms. But here's where things take a turn for the worse. There are a couple of places, in particular, where soul farming is laughably easy, by which I mean easy encounters that deliver an outsized parcel of souls, close to an archstone portal. As travelling through a portal resets enemies, you can simply run that loop over and over to fill your souls quickly, and with little risk or effort. For all the interesting things Demon's Souls seems to say about rules and breaking them, this didn't feel right. The option to approach levels in any order you want is welcome and a key component of allowing players to manage their frustration. But when combined with the lack of enemy scaling, there are some negative implications for gameplay. After a mid-game difficulty spike, the game gets progressively easier into the late game. Some of those later bosses become trivial. Then there's the so-called world tendency system, which isn't explained in-game. Dying in human form causes the combat difficulty in your current world to ratchet up, punishing you for failing. Killing a boss or invading player moves the needle back the other way, but these opportunities are rare, leaving new players, especially, potentially playing large swathes of the game on higher difficulty level. Not only is it obtuse and hostile to new players, but it skews player incentives in ways that seem broken. The best advice for new players is to ensure that you're in non-corporeal form at all times. You can do this without penalty by jumping to your death in the Nexus. But recall that in non-corporeal form, your health bar is halved. The world tendency system means you'll spend most of the game like that. It also means you'll almost always need to have the cling ring equipped, which serves to restore a portion of that lost health, which also means you'll only ever have one ring slot available to you for other buffs. The world tendency system interacts with the lore and story in other ways, which I won't spoil here, and I can see what FromSoft was going for. But most of those interactions concern more advanced players anyway, so why design it to be so punishing to beginners? The benefits from a game design perspective are a mystery to me. There's a very real sense in which Demon's Souls' gameplay systems are prototypical of what would come later in Dark Souls. I think it's pretty telling that world tendency was removed entirely from those games. Those are the big criticisms. How obtuse the thing is, and its balancing issues, particularly in the mid-game and particularly for new players. There are other curiosities. There are too many different crafting materials, for example, and the healing system is both too lenient and upsets the pacing by forcing you to stop what you're doing and go stock up on healing grass. But none of these materially detracted from my enjoyment. I thought it would be impossible for me to enjoy Demon's Souls, but it got under my skin, routinely keeping me up until 2 AM. I can't remember the last time I played something through twice, back to back, nothing to break it up, maybe never. Demon's Souls extracts a range of emotions from you as a player. That's the ultimate promise of the medium, isn't it? And yet we don't often see games that so belligerently explore failure and frustration, still largely taboo subjects in gaming. For me, Demon's Souls was also a meditation on my own relationship with the medium. I came out of it with a diminished appetite for quick gratification, for easy achievements, for open worlds, for the power fantasy. And even after 120 hours, there's still so much I haven't seen. Diehards swear that the real Demon's Souls starts with New Game Plus. There's online PvP with its own arcane rule set, although I turned this off as I found some of the in-game visual changes distracting. For a game that plays so elegantly with context, it's fitting that now, in 2022, Demon's Souls can't escape the context of the games it begat. It is prototypical, an embryonic form of what would become an entire genre. That status is both the reason it's revered and the reason that people give it a pass for some of its mistakes. By choosing to give Demon's Souls a technical and aesthetic overhaul without, in substance, touching the bones of what makes it Demon's Souls, Bluepoint shows us that, for whatever legitimate criticism you might level at it, it got so much fundamentally right. But for players that are less familiar with the series, and just for anyone who loves gaming really, there's too much here that's interesting and unique to be missed. And it looks so good doing it. Bluepoint's Demon's Souls remake is flawed and essential, and I don't know a better definition of a masterpiece.